Hey folks, Macho Models with a wrap up of the James Bond submarine car from Russia with Love. This was based off of a Lotus in the 1970s and driven by Sir Roger Moore. I'm sure you guys can look that up, but I highly encourage you to take a look at that. And then I wanted to continue the series where I talked to some of the build techniques that I went through so that you folks listening might be interested and potentially can take some of these lessons learned forward into your builds. But before I started, a lot of the stuff that I post on Instagram is mostly Gundam related or sci-fi related. I really wanted to try a car, and I would highly encourage any model builders out there, especially most of the folks who follow me or into Gundam, to check out cars. Cars are very difficult. This was a really interesting process, especially trying to get the gloss coat down. But aside from that, just the build within itself. Building cars is a lot different than Gundam. So with a Gundam, you have a modular bits that you can attach things onto, but with a car, you really have to commit to it. So for instance, one of the things that almost crushed my soul when I was going through this build was at the very end, putting this periscope tube in there. It was the last part of it. The whole thing was sealed up, and then I dropped in here to drill this hole to put it in here. I already had a hole drilled, but when I put the glass over, it covered the hole. So I had to drill the hole again, and as soon as I drilled the hole, all of these little dust bits collected inside here, and it was almost an hour for me to have to pop off the bottom of this to be able to get the dust out that it came out of the windshield. So it's kind of like weird stuff like that you don't really think about or have to think about with Gundam that's interesting for this. And another thing that I'll kind of come back to in terms of why you should do this if you're into modeling, especially if you largely consider yourself a Gundam modeler. I'm trying to build a lot of different skill sets. So I've been into modeling, I would say, seriously for the last year plus. And kind of like any other skill that I get after, I want to learn, as much about it as possible before I start to commit and specialize. That being said, learning how to do cars is a really good experience and patience, especially learning how to do gloss coats, and then same thing too, learning how to do some masking. So you see the masking isn't that great here. With Gundam, you can kind of come back and repaint an entire piece and kind of cover your mistakes. With a car, it's tough, and part of my modeling motto slash ethos is that I'm just trying to press through. Like, I've got a decent backlog of kits, but I don't want to sit and harp on mistakes too much. I really want to try to push forward and not let perfection be the enemy of good. So again, I'd highly recommend any kind of modelers out there to check out cars. It definitely requires a little bit different of a build process, but the nice part is the validation for me was that I was kind of able to successfully think through a lot of the issues that I was coming across, and I feel like for the first car that I ever built, I did a pretty good job of pushing through that. And that being said, this is an awesome looking car. I'm super stoked to give it to my dad for his birthday, which was back in July. I built him the Millennium Falcon in December, and he raised me and my brother on a really steady diet of James Bond movies. And before you come at me in terms of Roger Moore or Sean Connery, hey, you know what? A cool car is a cool car, and especially this one, which had a ton of super cool gadgets at the time. And then fast forward, I think Elon Musk bought the one that was sold at auction, which was curious because I always thought this thing was a model, but I guess, or I can assume that they built a full-size one for something, and Elon Musk has it. So who knows, when he does this kind of Hank Scorpio thing and takes over the world at some point, you might see this, leading an army of laser sharks across the Atlantic, but I digress. So I wanted to talk about three things within the build that you all might find interesting. And the first one I wanted to come back to is the all-clad aqua gloss. So I talked about this earlier, and some of my initial thoughts were right on. This stuff is awesome. It throws down really consistent, and it's really clean, and it definitely beats the heck out of Future. When doing a gloss coat, it can be a little intimidating. So the first one that I threw down, I think I had a recap video while the gloss coat was drying, or maybe it was right before that I sprayed it on. But when I came back to it the next day, the paint job was completely stippled. I was crushed. I was like, oh crap, I must have thrown this down wrong, or I didn't prep or clean the paint well enough. Well, as it turns out, that's just kind of a natural part of the process. No matter how good of a gloss coat you throw down, even working with Tamiya or whatever your desired medium is, you're typically going to get some kind of stippling on there. And then the way to overcome that is through sanding. So typically I've had the Tamiya sanding sponges, which are okay, but this job, you know, there's a lot of weird edges on here, and the Tamiya sanding sponge is very good for a flat edge. And then I also have a whole bunch of other bits and bobbles in terms of sanding papers, but the highest grit that I had up until late last week was about 2,000. So I did a little research, and then I found out about what's called micro mesh. And I got 2 sets of sanding sheets. I'm just going to show you one here, which I think is super keen. It's these sanding sheets, and I think I got these for $19 on Amazon, and I think typically what people use them for is for woodworking. But what's really neat is you have the sandpaper that's backed to like a latex piece right here. So it's nice and flexible, but it's also durable. Like I couldn't tear this if I wanted to. I'd have to cut it. And then the other kind of keen thing is if I flip this over, you can see this one goes all the way up to 12,000. And then I've got a number of different sheets on this one, and it's a really progressive sanding coat. I also got this in sponge form too, so it's much like the Tamiya sheets. And then the kick-ass part is like, I got a whole pack of the ones that are backed on the foam, and I think it was like $22, and you got something like 10 or 12 different cuts of this. And then Tamiya, it's something like $7, and you get one 7,000 grit. So these are where it's at. I'd highly recommend anybody who's big into modeling to take a look at these micro mesh sheets versus the Tamiya stuff. The Tamiya stuff's cute, but you know, you're really paying a premium just for the price tag. And this stuff's sold here in the States, and it's really rad. So needless to say, back to the paint job, when I came back to this whole section right here looked like a teenager's face. It was absolutely pocked. So an error that I made, and a good lesson learned, and you really can't tell on here unless you drill down into it, but you're supposed to start typically around 3,200. So I took a Tamiya sanding sheet with the foam back, and I went after this, and it actually was a little too abrasive on the paint. And if you really zoomed in, or you know, I had a 4K camera or whatnot, you'd probably be able to see some of these fine lines in here, but fortunately it doesn't really show on camera. But you're supposed to start at 3,200 and then progressively work your way up. So needless to say, if and when you guys go after putting clear coats on, throw down your first clear coat, 2 coats of medium, don't go too nuts with it, and then you're going to come back and you're going to see some pock marks. You're going to take your 3,200 sheet here, and then you're going to go and progressively work and sand those down, and then try to work all your way up till about 12,000 if you have the patience, and then come back and throw another coat of Alclad Aqua Gloss on here. Once I did that, it looked great. It looked almost flawless. Part 2 of that was then taking these Tamiya compounds that I showed you guys, or I should say part 3. So I threw the first coat down, and then I sanded, threw a second coat down, and then I did a little bit of light sanding. I think I did something at like 6,000, 8,000 grit. I didn't really have to do too much. And then the final part was this 2-part compound. So I used my fine, and then I went into the finish, and it looks good. It's not, you know, super like crazy high automotive gloss, but it's good. It's passes muster, and if I did another coat, I'd probably use this. But I'm also looking forward to getting that zero paint stuff at some point to really get that automotive, really hard cure on the coat. But this stuff works pretty well, works really well, I should say, and I'm definitely looking forward to incorporating this into my Gundam builds, especially replacing Future, which I think I mentioned in my earlier TV video that it's just too much of a gamble. The Future stuff doesn't really coat well, and it has a tendency to sag. This stuff works really, really well, and you only have to put down probably 2 medium coats if you're going to work with Gundam and you want to use it for decals or for washes. So that's a quick rundown of how to get the gloss coat, and also again these micro mesh pads, and then they also make them again with the mesh pad, I'm sorry, the foam back. So I would definitely go over, I'm going to continue to use these over Tamiya, and this is definitely going to be my new go-to sanding pad, especially for these large type surfaces. I still use sanding sticks for all the Gundam stuff and for taking down nubs, but for the larger surfaces, this worked out really, really well. The next thing that was really interesting to work with was super glue, or it's also called CA glue. I had another one. A lot of modelers are really into what's called Star Bond. So Star Bond's really good, but it's really equivalent to what most of the Gundam and other modelers use for the Tamiya extra thin cement. The viscosity on this, you can just see kind of me moving this around, is really, really high. That makes it really watery or low. I think it's high. Yeah, that's what makes it really, really watery. So these two are really, really watery. They're great for capillary action. So, you know, when there's two pieces fitting together, you could put this in here and it'll fit in nicely, and then it'll fuse the two elements if it's the same. So if it's plastic on plastic, it'll melt the plastic and pull it together. But this is the first time I'd really worked with a CA glue, not like Starbond. I really haven't used this too much. I prefer the Tamiya. But this is one with a higher viscosity, so, or I should say lower viscosity. This one's a bit more of a gel, so you can just kind of see as I move this through, it takes its time to be able to work through the bottle. And I think I mentioned this just a minute ago. It's called Bob Smith Industries. There's a YouTuber that I follow that's big into car builds, and this is his bread and butter for putting everything together. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, cars are way different than Gundam because you're really committing to this. So this car, you know, effectively I built this entire outer shell. I guess it was probably based on the earlier Lotus, and then they went ahead and cast all these little extra bits and bobbles to make it the Bond car. So I did most of this, and then I had to glue and fuse these rudders or ailerons or whatever they're called on submarines. And then there's another piece on the bottom here that I had to pull all together. So as I mentioned in the beginning, when I drilled this thing was really sealed shut, and it was sealed shut with the super glue. And working with the super glue, another really big pain in the butt that I got stuck with, and it's almost imperceptible on here, but you have to be exceptionally sparing with this to the point where like you're barely using it. I found myself when I went back a second time, I actually just ended up using a toothpick and then just really dabbing it lightly in here, because what happened was when I had the car before it was that final assembly where I put these rudders on, I had it flipped over, and all of these little, this is all one piece for the interior window, but these side, underneath here, there's actually plexiglass beneath the shields. And I had it flipped over and I was securing it. When I secured it, I put dabs of glue on each corner. Now, I stepped away and I came back and there was spidering all over the glass. So I guess what happened was when I dabbed it, I may have accidentally lifted it and pulled it forward. And it's almost imperceptible, like a spider's webbing, and it had drug on the glass. So this back windshield area looked like garbage. And what I had to do before I fused the whole car together, I had to come back and I actually sanded down all this window using the sheets that I mentioned earlier. And then I had to get really aggressive with it to the point that I actually killed. There were these really cool lines in here, which I can only assume was for the defroster, and they did a really good job putting that detail in. And I had to take it all out because I had these little dabs of super glue inside of here. So yeah, that was a really, really good lesson learned. And going back and looking at that other YouTuber's video, if I can pick up the link, I might put it in my story for anybody who's curious about car builds, or just message me directly and I'll look it up. But working with a super glue was a whole another process in itself. It's awesome though. It works really, really well. I had on my modeling bench a little while this Gorilla Glue, but it's just way too viscous. It barely moves. Like, this is the perfect blend between Gorilla Glue and the Tamiya Extra Thin Cement, and this was an excellent pickup. I actually, if you can see the label here, it's at Quarterstaff Games. We're up at Burlington, Vermont for a wedding, and I was walking around downtown, and I ran to this awesome games and modeling shop, and again, I just remembered from the YouTube video, this guy just kept saying Bob Smith Industries about 1 trillion times. So this is the bee's knees when it comes to CA super glue type stuff, and I'd highly recommend it to any builders out there. And just some final thoughts. Again, this was a really fun yet challenging build. I probably spent about 30 hours into this, and it was fun at parts, but it was also a little heart-wrenching at some points. But the heart-wrenching piece is good because it really teaches you patience, and I think a lot of this craft is that patience and being able to kind of think through roadblocks you might hit, or think ahead of where you're going to encounter problems. So that being said, to date, you know, building this car was probably my biggest challenge that I had, especially with just all the complexity and having to lock it down. So I'd highly encourage any Gundam or sci-fi modelers to try to seek out a car and try to build something. Another really awesome builder that I like, this guy named Robert Kampf. He does a lot of scratch-built Star Wars stuff, but every once in a while he does these like apocalyptic type cars, and I think I'd like to try that at some point. And you know, and I'd also like to try to put more cars in here, but rest assured that Macho Models is like largely dedicated towards sci-fi stuff, so I'm probably not going to be posting like a ton of cars on my feed anytime soon. But I hope you dig it. I hope you dig James Bond. I hope you liked listening through this and were able to pick up at least a couple tips. Again, the all-cloud was great. Micro mesh pads were awesome, and then this Bob Smith super glue is fantastic. So if you can walk away from these this 15-minute video with these 3 little nuggets, I hope that was worth your time. And again, please give me feedback on these videos. If you dig them, I'll continue to post more, and if not, we might go another direction. But that's all I got. Signing off.